I had spent 8 years putting dangerous men behind bars, but Adrian Moretti was the first one who looked at me as if the courtroom belonged to him, and I was the man standing trial. By 9 that morning, every seat in courtroom 4B was taken. Reporters packed the back row, deputies lined the walls, and half the city seemed to be waiting for me to prove that an Alpha Mafia boss could bleed under the same law as everyone else. I stood at the prosecution table with my case files arranged in exact order, my opening statement memorized, and one rule fixed firmly in my mind. Power did not change the truth. Mercer, my second chair, Julia Hayes, leaned close enough to keep her voice beneath the noise. "You're bending the folder." I looked down. The corner of the blue trial binder had folded beneath my thumb. I flattened it carefully. It was crooked. Julia gave me a look that said she knew better, then turned toward the side door as the bailiff called the room to order. Adrian entered without handcuffs. That had been negotiated for security reasons, though the explanation sounded less convincing when 6 armed deputies moved with him. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. He did not scan the reporters or acknowledge the whispers. His attention moved once across the room and stopped on me. No smile, no threat, just a long, level look that made the noise around us feel suddenly distant. I held it. Looking away would have meant something, and I refused to let him decide what. Adrian took his place beside his attorneys. One of them spoke quietly to him, but he kept watching me for another second before sitting. That small act changed the room. The reporters noticed. The defense noticed. Julia definitely noticed. "That was friendly," she murmured. "He's assessing the opposition." "Sure." Her mouth twitched. Very normal assessment. Completely free of murder. The judge entered before I could answer. We rose, the room settling into the disciplined silence I trusted. Silence had rules. Evidence had rules. Even fear became manageable once it had a procedure. Judge Holloway reviewed the schedule, warned both sides against speaking to the press, and asked whether there were any final matters before jury selection. The defense stood first. "Your Honor, we renew our objection to the prosecution's characterization of Mr. Moretti's business interests." I was already on my feet. "The characterization is supported by the evidence." Adrian's lead attorney turned toward me. "Allegations are not evidence, Mr. Mercer. Which is why we're here." A few reporters shifted behind us, sensing blood. Judge Holloway raised one hand. "Counselors, save the performance for the jury." I sat. Across the aisle, Adrian's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers tapped once against the table. Not nervous, deliberate, as if he had heard something in my answer that interested him. I had reviewed thousands of pages connected to Adrian Moretti, financial records, witness statements, surveillance logs, sealed reports. On paper, he was a network of decisions with human consequences. In person, he was harder to reduce. That irritated me more than it should have. During the first recess, I escaped into the narrow conference room behind the courtroom. Julia followed with 2 coffees and handed me the one without sugar. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "Pretending you're not affected because technically no one can prove you are." I opened the trial binder. "I'm focused." "You've read the same page 3 times." I looked down. She was right. I closed the file. "Moretti wants us distracted. He hasn't said a word. Men like him don't need to." Julia leaned against the table. "You know what I like about you? This sounds dangerous. You believe preparation can defeat human nature. Preparation defeats most things. That answer is why you need hobbies." Despite myself, I smiled. It lasted less than a second, but it loosened something in my chest. Then the door opened, and the bailiff stepped in. "Mr. Mercer, defense counsel wants to discuss the witness order before we resume." Of course they do. I stood, straightened my tie, and followed him back into the corridor. Adrian was there with his attorneys. Up close, his presence felt less theatrical and more controlled, like a locked door with something powerful behind it. His lawyer began discussing scheduling conflicts, but Adrian's attention remained on me. "Mr. Mercer," he said at last. His voice was quiet, almost polite. "Mr. Moretti, you seem very certain." "About the schedule?" One corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "About everything." His attorney stopped talking. So did mine. I should have ignored the bait. Instead, I chose the truth. Certainty isn't required. Evidence is. The faint amusement disappeared from Adrian's face, replaced by something sharper. Respect, perhaps. Or calculation. Then I hope you've read all of it, he said. The bailiff called us back before I could respond. I returned to the prosecution table with a new question pressing against the order I had built so carefully. What did Adrian Moretti believe I had missed? I opened my binder, faced the bench, and forced the question aside. The judge instructed the clerk to bring in the jury panel. Chairs shifted beyond the doors. Footsteps approached. Across the aisle, Adrian adjusted one cuff and met my eyes again. I had entered the courtroom believing the trial would test whether his power could survive the truth. As the doors opened, I understood something I had not prepared for. He intended to test me too. The jury panel had barely settled when the first sign came. Not pain, not fear, but heat. It started beneath my ribs and spread outward in one violent pulse, sharp enough to steal my breath. Across the aisle, Adrian Moretti went perfectly still. For one suspended second, the courtroom continued without us. The clerk read names. A reporter's pen scratched across paper. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses. Then Adrian's scent hit me. Cedar, smoke, and something darker I could not name. My body recognized it before my mind did. Mate. The word rose inside me with the certainty of a verdict. I gripped the edge of the prosecution table. The polished wood gave me something solid to hold while every instinct I had spent a lifetime controlling turned toward the man I was trying to convict. Adrian's chair scraped once against the floor. His attorneys looked at him, then at me. He did not look confused. That made it worse. His jaw locked. His eyes darkened. The calm Alpha who had walked into court surrounded by armed deputies now seemed to be containing something powerful enough to fracture the room. Mr. Mercer? Judge Holloway's voice cut through the roar in my ears. I forced myself upright. I'm fine, Your Honor. Julia leaned closer. You are absolutely not fine. Not now. Ethan, across the aisle, Adrian stood. Every deputy along the wall reacted at once. Hands moved toward holsters. The jury panel stirred. Sit down, Mr. Moretti, Judge Holloway ordered. Adrian ignored everyone except me. He needs air. His voice was rougher than before. Not louder. More dangerous because of how controlled it was. Heat surged again, dragging my attention toward him. My pulse matched something I could not see but somehow felt. His anger, his restraint, the brutal pull between us. I hated the intimacy of it. I hated that he knew I was struggling. Most of all, I hated that part of me trusted him when he said I needed to leave. Your Honor, Adrian's attorney began. My client may be experiencing an acute alpha response. A whisper moved through the gallery. The phrase was clinical enough to be useless. Everyone in the room understood what it might mean. Judge Holloway's gaze shifted between Adrian and me. Clear the jury panel. The clerk hesitated. Now. Chair scraped. Deputies guided the prospective jurors out while reporters stood on instinct, hungry for any detail. Judge Holloway pointed toward them. The gallery, too. No one publishes a word about what happened in this courtroom until I determine whether the proceedings have been compromised. That order created silence faster than any gavel. Within minutes, only the court staff, counsel, deputies, Adrian, and I remained. The doors closed. I could still feel him. Distance changed nothing. Mr. Mercer, the judge said, do you know what this is? I had built my career on answering only what I could prove. But denial would not restore control. It would only make me dishonest in the one room where honesty mattered most. Yes. The word came out flat. Julia stared at me. Adrian lowered his eyes for a fraction of a second, the first visible crack in his composure. Judge Holloway's expression tightened. And you, Mr. Moretti? Yes. No hesitation. No performance. Just fact. The truth landed between us like evidence neither side had disclosed. Judge Holloway ordered a recess and directed both legal teams into separate conference rooms. I made it 3 steps into ours before Julia shut the door and turned on me. Tell me I misunderstood. I placed both hands on the table. The heat had faded, but the awareness remained. A steady pressure beneath my skin, pointing through the wall toward Adrian. You didn't. You're bonded to the defendant. Apparently. Ethan, this is not an apparently situation. I know what situation it is. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Julia stopped. I took a breath. I know. For years, I had believed preparation could defeat human nature. Now human nature had announced itself in open court and attached itself to a man whose name appeared on every page of my case. Julia lowered her voice. You have to recuse yourself. The answer should have been immediate. Instead, my mind went to witnesses who had trusted me, evidence I had spent months building, and the quiet confidence in Adrian's voice when he told me to read all of it. Maybe, I said. Julia looked at me as if I had started speaking another language. Maybe. The bond does not decide what the evidence means. No, but it changes whether anyone believes you can evaluate it. That struck harder than the heat had. Fairness was not only a private conviction. It had to survive public scrutiny. Before I could respond, someone knocked. The bailiff opened the door. Judge Holloway wants both sides back. We returned to a courtroom emptied of spectacle. Adrian stood beside his attorneys, composed again, though the tension in his shoulders told me control was costing him. Judge Holloway looked at each of us in turn. This trial is suspended pending a conflict review. No contact between Mr. Mercer and Mr. Moretti outside the presence of counsel. No statements to the media. I expect written positions from both sides by tomorrow morning. Understood, I said. Adrian said nothing until the judge left. Then, with deputies waiting to escort him out, he looked directly at me. The bond tightened, not painfully, but unmistakably. I didn't choose this, I said quietly. His expression did not soften. Neither did I. It changes nothing. Then why are your hands shaking? I looked down. He was right. When I raised my eyes again, there was no triumph in his face. Only recognition. That disturbed me more than mockery would have. The deputies moved him toward the side door. He went without resistance, but just before disappearing, he glanced back once. The room felt colder after he left. Julia gathered our files in silence. I stared at the empty defense table, aware that the trial had not ended. It had become something far more dangerous. By tomorrow, I would have to decide whether I could remain the prosecutor who put Adrian Moretti on trial. Tonight, I had to survive being the mate his body had recognized before mine was ready to understand it. By the time I reached my office, I could still feel Adrian Moretti through 3 floors of concrete and locked courthouse doors. Not his thoughts. Not his emotions, just his presence, faint, persistent, impossible to ignore. Julia closed the door behind us and dropped the trial binders onto my desk. The conflict review memo is due at 8. I know, and the correct answer is recusal. I loosened my tie and looked out at the city. The courthouse windows reflected gray morning light back at me, cold and flat. The correct answer is whatever protects the integrity of the case. That is recusal. Maybe. Julia folded her arms. You said that yesterday. It still sounds insane. I turned from the window. If I leave now, the defense argues the bond compromised the prosecution from the moment it awakened. If I stay without review, they argue the same thing. Either way, the case becomes about us instead of the evidence. It already is about you. Only if we let it be. She stared at me for a long moment, then pulled out a chair. Fine. Then stop talking like a prosecutor and tell me what happened. I opened my mouth, but the answer caught somewhere behind my ribs. What happened was that my body had recognized a man. I had spent months preparing to convict. What happened was that Adrian had noticed my shaking before I did. What happened was that when he left the courtroom, some part of me had tracked every step until the bond stretched thin. I felt him, I said. Julia's expression softened, which somehow made it worse. And now? Still do. Does it affect your judgment? No, the answer came too fast. She heard it. So did I? I sat down and pulled the conflict rules toward me. That is what the review is for. For the next hour, I wrote as if precision could rebuild the wall the bond had destroyed. I documented the timing, the physical response, every statement made in court. No embellishment. No interpretation. Facts only. By 7:45, my memo was complete. The conclusion was narrow. I would submit to independent screening and temporary limitation, but I would not concede that the bond had erased my professional capacity. Julia read the final page twice. You know this could cost you. So could abandoning the case without cause. You have cause. I have a complication. Her eyes sharpened. That is exactly the kind of sentence a man says right before a complication ruins his life. Before I could answer, the secure line rang. Judge Holloway's clerk ordered both legal teams to appear in chambers. 20 minutes later, I entered with Julia and found Adrian already seated across from his attorneys. No jury. No reporters. No distance large enough to make him irrelevant. The bond stirred the moment our eyes met. I forced mine to the judge. Judge Holloway reviewed the submissions in silence. Adrian's side had requested my immediate removal. Mine requested an independent ethics assessment and a temporary stay. Mr. Mercer, she said, you understand why your continued role is difficult to defend. Yes, Your Honor. Yet you defend it. I defend the principle that a biological event should not automatically determine professional competence. Adrian's lead attorney leaned forward. That biological event ties him directly to my client. It does not alter the evidence. It alters him. The room went still. I looked toward Adrian before I could stop myself. He had not spoken since I entered. His expression was controlled, but there was tension around his mouth. Do you agree with your attorney? I asked. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. Mr. Mercer, he wants me removed, I said. I want to know whether that is his decision. Adrian finally looked at his lawyer. Give us a minute. Adrian, a minute. The command was quiet. It worked. Judge Holloway dismissed the attorneys into the outer chamber, but kept the bailiff inside. Julia gave me a warning look before leaving. When the door closed, Adrian and I faced each other across the polished table. You should recuse yourself, he said. Because you think I'm compromised? Because everyone else will. That was not my question. His gaze held mine. No, the answer unsettled me more than accusation would have. You don't think I'm compromised. I think you're stubborn enough to prosecute your own mate if you believe the evidence demanded it. That is not trust. No, his voice stayed even. It's observation. The word landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I had been studying him since the trial began, reducing every gesture to strategy. He had been doing the same to me. Then why ask for my removal? Because this bond gives people a reason to question every decision you make. If you convict me, they'll say you overcompensated. If you don't, they'll say I controlled you. So your solution is to take the decision away from me. My solution is to keep you from being destroyed by it. Anger rose so quickly it almost covered the shock beneath it. You don't know me well enough to protect me. I know you walked back into that courtroom with shaking hands because duty mattered more to you than fear. His eyes dropped briefly to my fingers resting on the table. They were steady now. That tells me enough. For the first time, Adrian Moretti did not sound like a defendant managing risk. He sounded like a man stating something he wished were not true. I hated that I noticed the difference. And what does your observation tell you now? I asked. That you've already decided to stay. I've decided the choice should be based on law, not instinct. Those are not always separate. They have to be. Something moved behind his expression, then disappeared. That, he said, is where we disagree. The attorneys returned. Judge Holloway ruled that I would remain temporarily assigned under independent ethics supervision while the court evaluated the conflict. Contact with Adrian would be restricted to formal proceedings and counsel-supervised meetings. It was not a victory. It was permission to keep standing where I already was. Outside chambers, Julia exhaled through her teeth. You got your review. For now. Down the corridor, deputies surrounded Adrian. Before they moved him away, he glanced back. No challenge this time. No amusement. Only the same measured attention he had given me in court. Except now I understood it was not intimidation. He had seen the risk before I admitted it existed. I returned to my office with the case still mine and certainty no longer intact. Adrian remained the man I intended to prosecute. But he was no longer only the man described in my files, and that distinction followed me long after the courthouse doors closed. For the next 3 days, I told myself the distinction did not matter. Adrian Moretti was still the defendant. I was still the prosecutor. The bond was a biological complication under review, nothing more. Then I found the witness statement buried beneath 12 pages of financial summaries. It came from Daniel Ruiz, a former driver in Adrian's organization, and I had read it twice before the trial. This time, one sentence stopped me. Moretti ordered everyone out before the shooting started. I pulled the original interview recording and listened again. Ruiz's voice shook through the office speakers. He described Adrian clearing civilians from a restaurant after learning that a rival crew was approaching. The defense would call it protection. My case theory called it control. Both interpretations fit the facts, but only one had made it into my notes. Julia stood beside my desk, reading over my shoulder. You missed that. I didn't miss it. You dismissed it. The difference sat between us. I closed the transcript. It doesn't erase the rest of the evidence. No, she studied me. But it changes what kind of man made the decision. I hated that she was right. The ethics monitor had restricted all contact with Adrian to recorded meetings with counsel present. So when the defense requested a conference about the witness list, I agreed before I could talk myself out of it. The meeting took place in a secure courthouse room with one camera, two attorneys, Julia, and enough polished wood to make honesty feel like testimony. Adrian entered last. The bond registered him instantly, a quiet pressure under my skin. I kept my eyes on the file. Daniel Ruiz, I said. Your former driver. Adrian sat across from me. Former employee. He says you cleared the restaurant before the rival crew arrived. His attorney shifted. That issue isn't relevant to witness scheduling. It affects how I evaluate his testimony. Adrian watched me without speaking. I continued. Why did you order the evacuation? Because people were going to get hurt. People outside your organization. They were still people. The answer was too simple. I searched his face for calculation and found only restraint. You expect me to believe concern for strangers guided that decision? No, his gaze hardened. I expect you to believe Ruiz when it hurts me and doubt him when it doesn't. Julia went still beside me. Adrian's attorney opened his mouth, but Adrian lifted one finger and the room stayed silent. He had identified the exact imbalance in my reasoning. I could have defended it. Instead, I chose to test it. Did you know the rival crew was targeting you? Yes. Then clearing the restaurant also protected your operation from public casualties. Yes. So it wasn't altruism. I didn't say it was. That answer changed something. He did not ask me to see him as innocent. He asked me to see the whole decision. You could have left, I said. I could have. But you stayed. Adrian leaned back. My people were still inside. The word people carried more weight than organization. For the first time, I understood that his loyalty was not an excuse he used after the fact. It was the architecture of his choices, dangerous and human at the same time. The realization did not weaken the case. It weakened my certainty about the man. We'll amend our summary of Ruiz's statement, I said. Julia turned toward me. Adrian's attorney looked equally surprised. To include the evacuation order, I added. The jury is entitled to the complete context. Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. That helps the defense. It helps the truth. Those aren't always the same thing. Today they are. The meeting ended without agreement on the full witness sequence, but the balance of power had changed. Adrian had challenged my reading of the evidence, and instead of resisting because the challenge came from him, I had corrected it. In the corridor, Julia waited until the defense team disappeared around the corner. You know the district attorney will ask why you added favorable context. Because it belongs in the record. That answer may not satisfy him. It satisfies me. She gave me a tired look. That is exactly what worries me. The district attorney called 20 minutes later. Martin Cole had supervised me for 6 years and trusted facts more than people, which was one reason we worked well together. The defense says you revised the Ruiz summary. I corrected an omission. An omission you discovered after bonding with the defendant. The timing doesn't make the evidence less real. Silence filled the line. Ethan, your job is not to make Moretti understandable. My job is not to make him monstrous either. The words came out before I could soften them. Cole's voice cooled. Be careful. The call ended. I sat alone with the receiver still in my hand. 3 days earlier, I would have heard his warning as protection. Now I heard the assumption beneath it. Complexity was dangerous when conviction required certainty. That evening, I found Adrian in the courthouse holding area during another counsel-supervised review. A deputy stood by the door. Both attorneys remained within sight. Adrian noticed the revised witness summary in my file. You changed it. I corrected it. Your office won't like that. My office doesn't have to like the evidence. For the first time, he smiled without mockery. It was brief, tired, and unexpectedly real. You are stubborn. You already established that. I thought it was pride. And now, his eyes held mine. Now I'm not sure. The answer should not have mattered. It did. The bond warmed quietly, but the deeper shift had nothing to do with instinct. Adrian had revised his judgment of me because of something I chose to do. And I had revised mine because he had refused to make himself easier to defend. When I left the courthouse, the city lights were coming on one block at a time. My case remained intact. My duty had not changed. But the line between fairness and distance no longer looked as clean as it had before. The next decision I made would prove whether that realization was only intellectual or whether it had already begun changing the prosecutor I believed I was. The next decision came before I had time to pretend nothing had changed. At 8 the following morning, Martin Cole placed a sealed motion on my desk and told me the district attorney's office wanted it filed before noon. Protective limitation, he said. We narrow the witness record, exclude the Ruiz context, and keep the trial focused. I read the motion once. Then again. The language was clean, strategic, legally defensible. It also treated the evacuation order as irrelevant because it complicated the prosecution's narrative. This removes material context, I said. Cole closed my office door. It removes a distraction. The defense will challenge it. Let them. The burden is still ours. Exactly. I set the pages down. Which is why we cannot ask the jury to believe only the parts that make conviction easier. His face hardened. This is not about fairness anymore, Ethan. It's about whether your judgment has been altered. My judgment changed because I reviewed the evidence correctly. After bonding with Moretti, there it was again. The assumption that emotion could only contaminate reason, never expose its blind spots. A week earlier, I would have accepted that premise without question. Now I could see the flaw because it was mine too. I won't file this, I said. Cole stared at me. That is not a request. Then assign it to someone else. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. He stepped closer to my desk. You understand what you're risking? Yes. Your position on the case? Yes. Your career? My throat tightened, but I kept my voice level. If my career requires me to hide evidence because it complicates the story we prefer, then I'm already risking it. Cole picked up the motion. You think this proves you're impartial? No. I think the record should be complete whether I'm here or not. He left without another word. The door shut softly, which was worse than a slam. Julia appeared 5 minutes later, took one look at my face, and leaned against the frame. How bad? I refused to file Cole's motion. So catastrophic. Potentially. She came in and closed the door. Was it the right call? Yes. Then why do you look like someone died? I glanced at the framed certificate on the wall, the one my father had hung in my first office because I had been too embarrassed to display it myself. For 8 years, I had built every part of my identity around being useful to the law. Refusing Cole did not feel like rebellion. It felt like cutting away the only structure I trusted. Because being right does not make the cost imaginary, I said. Julia nodded once. No joke this time. What happens now? We submit the revised witness summary. We disclose the dispute to the ethics monitor. And we prepare for reassignment. You're still saying we. Until someone tells me otherwise. The formal case conference was scheduled that afternoon. Adrian arrived with his attorneys and the same guarded calm he wore like armor. The bond acknowledged him before I did, but the feeling no longer carried the same panic. It had become a fact in the room. Unwanted, undeniable, but not in control. I handed the revised witness packet across the table. The prosecution will not seek to exclude the evacuation evidence. Adrian's lead attorney flipped through the pages. Your office agreed to this? The prosecution is disclosing its position. That was not my question. It was the answer. Adrian looked at me carefully. What did it cost? His attorney turned toward him, but he ignored the warning. I should have refused to discuss internal matters. Instead, I chose honesty without detail. Enough. Something in his expression tightened. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. For me, the question was quiet enough that only the people nearest us heard it. My pulse kicked once. For the case. Adrian held my gaze. That answer used to mean something different when you said it. He was right, and I resented how easily he heard it. Before, the case had meant winning through disciplined certainty. Now it meant protecting the process even when the truth became inconvenient to me. Maybe I understand it differently now, I said. The admission changed the room more than I expected. Julia looked down at her notes. Adrian's attorney stopped turning pages. Adrian did not smile, but some of the tension left his shoulders. Then we understand each other, he said. Do not assume that. I didn't. His voice remained calm. I observed it. The callback should have irritated me. Instead, it almost made me laugh. Almost. The meeting moved to witness scheduling, evidentiary limits, and the practical consequences of the suspended trial. Yet the power between us had shifted. Adrian no longer spoke as if every word were a weapon. I no longer treated every pause as manipulation. We still challenged each other, but the purpose had changed. We were no longer trying only to expose weakness. We were testing whether the other man meant what he said. Near the end, the ethics monitor asked whether either of us believed the bond had influenced the revised disclosure. Adrian answered first. No, every head turned toward him. His attorney's face went blank. The monitor lifted a pen. You're stating that the prosecutor's decision was independent? I'm stating that Mercer would have corrected the record if the defendant were anyone else. I felt the force of that trust precisely because he did not call it trust. The monitor looked at me. Mr. Mercer? I could have protected myself by minimizing the change. Instead, I said, the bond forced me to examine my assumptions. The evidence changed my decision. Julia inhaled softly. Adrian's eyes sharpened. That distinction matters, I continued. Influence is not the same as control. When the conference ended, Adrian paused beside the door while the deputies waited. You could have lied, he said. So could you. I usually do it better. There was dry humor in his voice, faint but real. I'll keep that in mind. He studied me for one final second. You already do. Then he left. By evening, Cole had removed me from supervisory control of the trial strategy, but had not taken the case away. Not yet. I remained the prosecutor, though with less authority, more scrutiny, and no safe path back to the man I had been before the bond awakened. I had believed integrity meant keeping emotion outside every decision. Now I understood the harder truth. Integrity meant knowing emotion was present and choosing honestly anyway. That choice had cost me power. It had also given Adrian a reason to believe me. And once that trust existed, even in its smallest, most fragile form, neither of us could return to being only prosecutor and defendant. The first consequence arrived the next morning, when Martin Cole handed me a revised case order with my name moved beneath Julia's. You're still assigned, he said, but every strategic decision goes through her and the ethics monitor. Julia stood beside me, visibly uncomfortable with the promotion. I read the order without reacting. Understood. Cole watched me sign it. That's all. Would an argument change it? No, then I'll save us both the time. His expression suggested he preferred anger. Anger would have confirmed that I had become unstable. Compliance gave him nothing. But when he left, Julia placed the order face down on my desk. I didn't ask for this. I know. I'm not supervising you. On paper you are. Ethan. I met her eyes. The case matters more than my title. Saying it was easier than feeling it. By noon, the court approved a limited restart of pretrial proceedings. Every filing would be reviewed, every contact recorded, every decision measured against the bond. Adrian's defense responded by challenging 3 prosecution witnesses and demanding expanded disclosure. It was aggressive, but not reckless. He was testing whether my commitment to fairness would survive when fairness hurt. My position. The first test came during a recorded conference over a surveillance witness whose account supported our timeline, but contradicted an earlier statement. Julia recommended withdrawing him before the defense could expose the inconsistency. We can proceed without him, she said, and avoid handing them an impeachment victory. Adrian sat across the table, silent. His attorney waited for my response. I looked at both statements. The contradiction was real, but so was the witness's explanation. Removing him would protect the prosecution. Calling him would give the defense a weapon and the court a fuller record. We disclosed both statements, I said. Julia's jaw tightened. And call him. If the monitor approves. Adrian's attorney smiled without warmth. That is generous. It is transparent. Adrian finally spoke. Those aren't the same thing. No, I said. Transparency costs more. His gaze stayed on mine. He understood exactly what I meant. The monitor approved the disclosure but deferred the witness decision. By the time the meeting ended, the defense had gained leverage. My office had gained another reason to question me, and Adrian had gained proof that my last choice had not been accidental. In the corridor, he slowed as the deputies repositioned around him. You're making their argument for them, he said. Which argument? That the bond changed you. It did. His eyes narrowed. That is a dangerous admission. Only if change means corruption. For once, he had no immediate answer. The next pressure came from the bond itself. During a closed evidentiary review that afternoon, Adrian's attorney played security footage from the restaurant incident. The images were grainy and silent, but Adrian's movements were unmistakable, directing civilians toward an exit while armed men entered through the rear. Then the screen showed him turning back. The bond tightened so suddenly that my breath caught. Not attraction. Fear. Mine, or some brutal mixture of both. Adrian's hand closed around the edge of the table. He did not look at the screen. He looked at me. Do you need a recess? Julia asked. Every person in the room waited for my answer. If I said yes, Cole would call it proof. If I said no to preserve appearances, I would be making the same mistake I had spent days defending against, pretending emotion disappeared when ignored. 5 minutes, I said. The monitor noted it. Adrian's attorney noted it. So did Adrian. Outside the room, I braced one hand against the cold stone wall. Julia stood beside me, without speaking until my breathing steadied. That was the right call, she said. It will be used against me. Probably. You're terrible at reassurance. You're terrible at accepting it. When we returned, Adrian was composed again. The footage resumed. This time, I watched the evidence instead of fighting the reaction it caused. The consequence was immediate. I noticed a detail everyone had missed. Adrian had not simply turned back for his own men. He had redirected one of them toward a second exit before advancing deeper into the building alone. I requested the footage be paused. Who was still inside? His lawyer objected to the question's scope, but Adrian answered. 2 employees and a cook. Your people. One was. And the others? No, the room shifted. The prosecution's theory of controlled self-preservation became harder to maintain. So did the defense's attempt to present him as entirely selfless. He had protected strangers and loyalists alike while remaining embedded in a violent system. Complexity did not absolve him. It made judgment harder. After the review, Adrian asked for a brief counsel-supervised exchange. You could have ignored that detail, he said. So could you when your attorney objected. I knew what it would cost. So did I. His expression tightened. That is the problem. What is? You keep paying for the truth as if the bill belongs only to you. The words struck deeper than I expected. You want me to stop? I want you to understand what your office will do when your usefulness becomes smaller than your liability. You sound concerned. I am practical. That's not what I asked. The bond carried a pulse of restrained frustration. Adrian looked toward the observation camera, then back at me. I don't want your trust if receiving it destroys you. It was the closest either of us had come to naming what had formed between us. I could have stepped back. Instead, I made the harder choice. You don't get to decide what my integrity costs. His face went still. And you don't get to pretend the cost ends with you. The deputies approached before I could answer. He left with the tension unresolved, but not broken. That evening, Cole suspended my authority to question witnesses without written approval. The ethics monitor scheduled an emergency review. Julia warned me that reassignment was no longer theoretical. I sat alone at my desk, surrounded by evidence that had become more truthful and less useful with every decision I made. Adrian had trusted me enough to stop protecting himself from my judgment. I had trusted him enough to believe his concern was not manipulation. Neither trust had made the case easier. It had only raised the price of every choice. And as the courthouse emptied around me, I understood that the next consequence would not test whether I could remain impartial. It would test how much of my life I was willing to lose proving that impartiality could include humanity. The emergency review began at 9 the next morning, and by 9:15, I understood Martin Cole had already decided what I was. Not compromised. Not confused. Dangerous. The ethics monitor sat at the head of the conference table with my disclosure memos arranged in front of him. Cole occupied one side. Julia sat beside me on the other, silent but rigid. Through the glass wall, I could see the courthouse corridor and the deputies stationed outside the room where Adrian waited with his attorneys. I could feel him there too, a muted pressure beneath my ribs, close enough to register and too far away to reach. Mr. Mercer, the monitor said, you disclosed favorable context, refused a supervisory filing, requested a recess during evidentiary review, and continued to participate after acknowledging that the bond altered your assumptions. Correct. Cole leaned forward. He also discussed the personal cost of those choices with the defendant. In a recorded, counsel-supervised exchange. That doesn't make it appropriate. I looked at him. No. It makes it reviewable. His mouth tightened. The monitor turned a page. Do you believe your objectivity remains intact? It was the question everyone wanted reduced to yes or no. A clean answer for a situation that was no longer clean. I believe objectivity requires me to examine my assumptions, I said. That is not the same as pretending I have none. Cole exhaled sharply. This is philosophy. We are discussing prosecutorial fitness. We're discussing whether honesty about influence is more dangerous than denying it. Julia's hand shifted beside mine, a small warning to stay measured. I already was. That was the problem. Every calm answer sounded like defiance because I no longer accepted the premise behind their questions. The monitor closed the file. Pending final review, you are removed from active authority in the Moretti prosecution. The words were quiet. The consequence was not. My badge stayed in my pocket. My title remained. But the case, the one I had built, defended, and nearly dismantled myself to protect, was no longer mine to shape. Julia turned toward me. Temporary, she said. Cole did not look at her. Effective immediately. I signed the acknowledgement because refusing would change nothing. Character. Decision. Consequence. The sequence had brought me here with brutal efficiency. Outside the room, Adrian was being escorted toward a separate conference. He saw the paper in my hand and stopped. One deputy touched his arm. Adrian did not move until I did. They removed you, he said. It was not a question. His attorney stepped between us. No direct contact. We're standing in a public corridor, Julia said. And every word is being recorded. Adrian's attention stayed on me. Was it worth it? I should have said yes. I had chosen truth over convenience, context over strategy, humanity over the illusion of distance. But in that moment, with my authority gone and months of work passing into someone else's hands, certainty felt like another kind of lie. I don't know, I said. The admission hit him harder than anger would have. The bond tightened with a flash of something cold and guarded. Then you should have stopped sooner. You told me not to let you decide the cost. And you told me the cost was yours. His voice remained low, but the space between us changed. You were wrong. I understood too late what he meant. Every action I took in the name of fairness had become evidence against him too. The prosecution could argue I had been manipulated. The defense could argue I had been compromised. Adrian's refusal to exploit the bond no longer protected either of us. It only left him exposed to consequences he could not control. Adrian, don't. His expression closed with frightening speed. You wanted the truth in the record. Now live with all of it. The deputies moved him away. He did not look back. The absence of that final glance hurt more than it should have. By noon, Cole assigned the case to a senior prosecutor from another division. Julia remained attached for continuity, but I was instructed to surrender my notes and avoid all substantive contact with the team. I packed 8 months of my life into 3 archive boxes while strangers reviewed decisions I had once considered unquestionably mine. Julia stood in the doorway. You did not ruin the case. That remains to be seen. Ethan. I closed the last box. He was right. About what? The cost did not end with me. She did not answer, which was answer enough. That afternoon, the new prosecutor filed notice that the office would reassess every disclosure made after the bond awakened. Not reverse them, reassess them. A careful word with a vicious implication. My judgment had become suspect retroactively. Every fair decision now looked contaminated. Every correction looked personal. The very honesty I had defended could be used to discredit the truth it uncovered. I sat alone in the empty conference room after everyone left, staring at the dark monitor where the restaurant footage had played. I had believed my false certainty was the problem. Now the opposite possibility opened beneath me. What if empathy had not made me wiser? What if it had only made me easier to deceive? The bond offered no answer. Adrian had shut himself down so completely that I could barely sense him. For the first time since the courtroom, the silence between us felt deliberate. I called Julia before I could lose the nerve. I need the independent evidence log, I said. The one that tracks every decision before and after the bond. You're barred from the case. I know. Then why? I looked at the boxes stacked beside the door. Because I need to know whether I changed the truth or finally started seeing it. She was quiet for several seconds. And if you don't like the answer? My hand tightened around the phone. Then I stopped defending myself. When the call ended, I remained in the dark until the courthouse lights shut off section by section. I had lost my authority. Adrian had withdrawn the trust we had barely begun to build. My belief in distance had failed, but I could no longer trust closeness either. By morning, I would have to examine every choice I had made and decide whether integrity meant fighting to return, or admitting I had become exactly what everyone feared. By 8 the next morning, I had an answer. It was not the one Martin Cole expected, and it was not the one I had feared. Julia had sent me the independent evidence log at 2:13 a.m. without comment. I spent the rest of the night comparing every decision I had made before the bond awakened with every decision I made after. The pattern was brutal in its simplicity. I had not softened the evidence for Adrian. I had corrected the places where I had hardened it against him. The surveillance footage, the Ruiz statement, the witness contradiction. Each revision followed the same standard I had applied in other cases whenever I forced myself to look beyond the prosecution's preferred narrative. The difference was not that the bond had corrupted my judgment. It was that Adrian had made it impossible for me to hide from the assumptions already inside it. At 9, I walked into Judge Holloway's courtroom without a case file. Cole stood at the prosecution table beside the newly assigned attorney. Adrian sat with his defense team, his expression closed. He looked at me once, then away. The bond barely moved. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Mercer, you are not counsel of record." "No, Your Honor." "Then why are you here?" "To submit a statement regarding my conduct and the integrity of the evidence review." Cole rose immediately. "The state objects. Mr. Mercer has been removed from active authority, which is why I am not making a legal argument for either side." I placed a single document on the clerk's desk. "I am accepting responsibility for my decisions." That got Adrian's attention. Judge Holloway read the first page in silence. "You compared your post-bond disclosures against prior case practices." "Yes." "And your conclusion?" My pulse was steady. For the first time in days, I did not need certainty to feel grounded. The bond influenced my awareness. It did not control my choices. The corrected disclosures were legally and ethically required. I should have identified the omissions earlier. Cole's jaw tightened. "You're admitting bias." "I'm admitting I had blind spots." I turned toward him. "Those are not the same thing." The courtroom remained quiet. No jury, no reporters, just the people whose decisions would determine whether truth could survive everyone's fear of appearance. Judge Holloway looked toward the new prosecutor. "Has the state completed its reassessment?" The attorney stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. The evidence disclosed after the bond awakening is accurate and material. We do not intend to withdraw it." A pressure released in my chest. Not victory. Confirmation. The truth no longer depended on whether anyone trusted me. It had survived independent review. Adrian's attorney rose next. Then the defense renews its motion to remove the prosecution team for institutional prejudice. Adrian spoke before she finished. No, every head turned toward him. His lawyer lowered her voice. "Adrian." The evidence was reviewed. The office still attempted to limit, and Mercer stopped them. His gaze met mine across the room. The bond stirred, cautious and painful. He paid for that decision. I won't pretend it did not happen because anger is easier. His attorney sat back, visibly frustrated. Judge Holloway studied him. "Mr. Moretti, are you withdrawing the motion?" Adrian's eyes did not leave mine. That portion of it. It was not surrender. It was trust offered with full knowledge of the cost. Judge Holloway ruled that the revised disclosures would remain, the independent monitor would continue, and the trial would proceed under the newly assigned prosecutor. I would not return as lead counsel. The decision should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt clean. The case would continue. The evidence would be complete. My role had changed, but the principle had survived. When the hearing ended, Cole intercepted me near the aisle. "You sacrificed your position to defend a defendant's narrative." "No." I looked back at the prosecution table, then at Adrian. "I defended the record. You could have stayed silent. That would have protected me, not justice." Cole's expression hardened, but I no longer needed him to approve the distinction. He walked away. Julia waited beside the doors. "You know this probably ends your path to chief prosecutor." "Probably." "You sound disturbingly calm." "I'm trying something new." Her mouth twitched. "Humanity. Don't make it dramatic." Too late. Adrian's attorneys requested one final supervised exchange before he was taken back into custody. We stood in the same secure conference room where our first honest conversation had begun, only now there was no case strategy left for me to protect. Adrian remained near the opposite side of the table. "You proved them wrong," he said. Not entirely. You proved the decisions were sound. I also proved I should have seen the evidence more clearly before the bond. His expression shifted. You are still determined to punish yourself. I'm determined to be accurate. There's the prosecutor. Former lead prosecutor. Still you. The words settled between us. For months, I had believed my identity depended on authority, distance, and being the person with the answer. Losing the case had stripped those things away. What remained was simpler and harder. The ability to choose what was right when no role guaranteed it. You withdrew the motion, I said. Because the evidence was fair. That is not the whole reason. Adrian looked toward the camera, then back at me. The guarded alpha who controlled every room seemed suddenly tired. No, then say the rest. His jaw tightened. Vulnerability cost him more than silence ever had. Because I trusted you, he said. The bond warmed, but I did not let it answer for me. I stepped closer only when he stayed where he was. I trust you too. His eyes searched mine. Because of this? Because of what you did when using the bond against me would have been easier. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. That is a dangerous distinction. I've learned to live with those. He almost smiled. The deputies approached the door. Our time was over. Adrian looked at me once more, not as a defendant measuring a prosecutor, and not as an alpha claiming a mate. As a man waiting to see whether another man would choose him freely. The trial continues, he said. I know, and you may not like the outcome. Trust is not acquittal. No, his voice softened. It isn't. He left without looking back, but this time the absence did not feel like rejection. The central question had changed. I was no longer deciding whether duty or destiny would define me. Neither would. My choices would. The trial would determine Adrian's legal future. What came after would determine ours. The verdict came 6 weeks later. By then, I no longer had an office overlooking the courthouse. My reassignment had become permanent, pending the ethics board's final recommendation. I still carried my badge, but it no longer defined the way I walked through those marble halls. On the morning the jury returned, I entered through the public doors instead of the secure entrance for attorneys. No one stopped me. No one greeted me either. For the first time in 8 years, I was simply another observer waiting to see whether the system I had devoted my life to would honor the truth we had fought to protect. Adrian was already seated when I entered. The new prosecutor reviewed notes without looking at him. Adrian sat perfectly still, dressed in the same dark suit he had worn throughout the proceedings. He looked toward me only once. There was no urgency in his expression, no silent plea, no expectation that I would rescue him. The bond was quiet, not absent. Peaceful. We had finally stopped asking it to make our decisions. Judge Holloway thanked the jury for its service before accepting the verdict forms. The courtroom held its breath. On count 1, she began. I listened as each charge was read. Some counts ended with guilty. Others ended with not guilty. The evidence had spoken with the same complexity it had always contained. Adrian was neither the monster the headlines wanted nor the innocent man the bond might have tempted me to imagine. He was held accountable for the crimes the jury found proven beyond a reasonable doubt. He was cleared where the evidence failed to meet that burden. Justice had not become mercy. It had become precise. I realized then that precision had been what I wanted all along. I simply had mistaken certainty for precision. Adrian accepted the verdict without visible reaction. Only when Judge Holloway concluded the hearing did he allow himself a slow breath. Before deputies escorted him away for sentencing proceedings, he looked at me across the courtroom. No triumph. No bitterness. Just recognition. The same recognition that had begun the day our mate bond awakened in open court, transformed now into something neither instinct nor fate had created on its own. Weeks later, after sentencing, Adrian became eligible for transfer to a lower security rehabilitation facility because several convictions had been dismissed while others carried reduced penalties under the jury's findings. The legal process continued exactly as it should. Appeals remained available. Consequences remained real. Nothing about loving someone erased responsibility for what they had done. That truth mattered more to me than any fantasy ever could. I visited only after every restriction allowed it. No special treatment. No hidden meetings. Every approval carried signatures and waiting periods. The first time we sat across from each other without attorneys, judges, or ethics monitors listening to every word, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Adrian smiled first. It was still rare enough to surprise me. "You're late," he said. "By 6 weeks. You noticed." I always noticed. I laughed quietly. It felt unfamiliar after so many months of measuring every sentence. "You could have come sooner," he said. "No." I shook my head. I needed to know I was choosing this without the case standing between us. He studied me carefully. "And now there isn't a prosecutor and a defendant in this room." "No." His voice softened. "There are just 2 stubborn men. One more stubborn than the other. I'm willing to negotiate that point." We both smiled, and for the first time since the courtroom, the silence between us felt earned instead of uncertain. Adrian rested his hands on the table. "Do you regret it?" I knew exactly what he meant. Not the bond. Everything. Refusing Cole. Correcting the record. Losing my position. Letting go of the certainty that had shaped my entire career. I considered the question longer than either of us expected. "I regret every person who was hurt by my blind spots," I said at last. "I regret the years I believed justice only meant winning." I met his eyes. "But I don't regret learning the difference." Adrian nodded slowly. "Neither do I. You once told me you didn't want my trust if receiving it destroyed me." I remember. It didn't destroy me. My voice remained steady. It changed me. He leaned back with the smallest hint of relief crossing his face. "Good. You?" I asked. "What changed?" Adrian looked through the window beside us where late afternoon sunlight stretched across the prison yard. "I spent my life believing trust made people weak." He turned back toward me. "Then I met the one man who kept telling the truth even when it cost him everything." I smiled. "It didn't cost me everything." "No." He raised an eyebrow. I reached across the table. There was no instinct pushing my hand forward this time. No supernatural pull. Just a decision. Adrian looked at my hand for a moment before placing his own over it. "Warm. Real. Chosen." "No," I said. "It brought me here." Months later, after the ethics board completed its review, I received a letter restoring my professional standing. The report concluded that my conduct had reflected unusual circumstances but had remained ethically defensible because every disputed decision had ultimately been validated by independent review. Cole never apologized. He didn't have to. When we passed each other in the courthouse one final time, he simply nodded. I returned the gesture. Some endings did not require agreement. Only acceptance. I eventually returned to public service in a different division, one where my responsibility was training younger prosecutors. On the first day of every class, I placed an empty evidence binder on the desk and told them the same thing. Never confuse certainty with truth. Your job isn't to win a story. Your job is to protect the whole record, especially the parts that make your case harder. None of them knew where that lesson had come from. They didn't need to. Some truths become more valuable when they stop belonging to only one person. Adrian completed the first stage of his sentence with the same discipline that had once made him dangerous and now made him accountable. We wrote letters. We argued. We laughed more often than either of us expected. We built something slower than fate and stronger than instinct. The mate bond had brought us into the same courtroom. It had never promised us love. We chose that ourselves, one honest decision at a time. Looking back, people often ask me whether destiny changed my life the day I stood across from an Alpha Mafia boss and felt the bond awaken before an entire courtroom. I always give them the same answer. Destiny opened a door. Justice demanded I walk through it honestly. Love was simply the person waiting on the other side.